The views and opinions in this program are not those of CISA 7 or Spectrum.
Meeting again tomorrow from 9 a.m. until 2. And we have two guests today who are going to help facilitate the next 2 days, Casey Jackson and Janelle Williams. And welcome again. You came and worked with us the last time we did this. And so at this point, we've got 5 board members here. I know Eric is going to be about 10-15 minutes late, and Christina has a emergency that she's working through and may or may not be able to get here.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here. Janelle and I look forward to coming back and doing another facilitation session. We're going to start off, before we really get into the meat and potatoes today, really looking at developing some norms. And I'd like to hear from the board in terms of what they would like in terms of norms. So if we could start off with that, that'd be great.
Were you going to? You look like you're about to say something.
Can you give me just a little bit more of what you're looking at? I need to understand a little bit more about what you mean by norms. I mean, norms of how we are conducting ourselves, norms of what we hope to get out of this, like just a little bit more.
Great. So let's call it rules of engagement and how we're going to behave in terms of idea generation, in terms of discussion, in terms of when we have ideas, how we're going to present them, and every voice matters, those kinds of things.
Doesn't quite apply. No.
I would just say that kind of remembering what we did last summer when you were here, I was very happy with that. I thought you did a great job of helping us stay on track, not wander too far off our goals, and to keep us focused and to make sure everyone participates. So I was more of the same, I guess, that's my answer.
Rhonda?
I would echo that as well.
I would say that I know we're going to be doing probably tomorrow a lot of idea generating, and I think it would be important that all ideas are given consideration, regardless of whether anybody at the table thinks that at the time it's mentioned whether it's a good idea that they can support, so that we are able to consider lots of different ideas. I think respectful listening.
Adrian, what do you think?
I don't think I have anything to add that would go beyond that.
Right.
Yeah.
We can do that. We'll be in good shape.
Yeah? Okay, you're in agreement then. Perfect.
Yep.
I'd like to also add a couple of things from my perspective is to really be open, right? Because you have an open mind. Everybody has different ideas. Want to be respectful of that. I'm also going to ask that you please check your egos at the door. And that understanding that you all play very different positions, not only for the board, but also in the community, and to really look at things from a holistic standpoint and putting the kids at the center of what we're trying to accomplish. Thank you. Okay, if we go to slide 2, just want to reiterate the desired outcomes from this retreat. The board will gain a shared understanding of the district's current and future enrollment, affirm the guiding change document, identify potential solutions the Board of Education wishes to explore further, agree to the timeline and methodology for public participation for exploration. Are we all in agreement that that's the outcome? Is there anything you want to add to this?
I just want to verify that this is being recorded. Right? It is? No, I mean like for the public. Okay. I forgot to ask that earlier. Thank you. Thank you.
Did we have, I don't recall from last summer, but were these similar to last summer, or did we, I can't remember even doing this last summer, but, you know, I'm assuming that we did something similar.
I would say yes. It was probably not on the actual presentation, but we talked about them in terms of what we wanted to gain, what were the outcomes going to be after our, I think, a half-a-day session.
Thank you.
Want to make sure we're good with these. There's 4 up there. If we need to make a change and you want to adjust, we need to know that. Are we good?
And this covers both days?
Both days.
Okay. Andrew?
I just want to make sure, and I I think we all know this, but this process will involve, as it says there, looking at what we wish to explore further. And I just don't want there to be confusion that anything we explore further and decide to move forward to public participation for exploration is in any kind of way a vote that we're going to do that thing. Whether or not those things come up for a vote in the future, I think there's a strong commitment to very open public feedback with plenty of time for anything that's on this list. So just so there may be ideas that you know, I might think I am not a fan of that, but certainly merits that next step of public input.
Yes, that's exactly right. If you look at the last bullet, it really talks about that exploration, correct? Because I think what we're trying to say is we're going to have all these great ideas. We're going to generate a lot of enthusiasm. We're also going to get the community's input in terms of what options we're looking at, and then explore those further. I think that's the whole idea. Anything you want to add to that? Are we good? Are we clear? Rhonda?
And I would go even further to say that the third bullet point where it talks about the Board of Education wishes to explore further, for me, some of that would be contingent on what the public participation and input looks like.
Yep.
Although to this 2-day retreat, explore further is what we've decided to explore.
That is correct.
But then the
You want to take it to the
continued
next
exploration will come after the public participation. Yep. In terms of what we decide are good solutions.
Yep. Anything else? Laura, are you good? Katie? Brenda? Andrew? Rhonda? Okay. Sorry, if we could just go to the next slide. I'm going to turn this over to the superintendent to just walk us through everything that's been done to date.
Thank you and good evening. We look forward to sharing this information, not only to take us back to where we started this conversation, but also to help bring us forward, because there are implications that occurred along the way that you might wish to consider in the discussions in the next several days. Beginning with phase 1, we began with a facility study, and many of you probably recall that Plunkett and Rasich and Associates came in and went from school to school. All 42 schools were visited, and the associate or the architect who was with Nick Kent, he actually spent time with the principal. There were a parent involved, as well as students, to talk about the current facilities, not only the condition of the facilities, but the use of the facilities, and looking at space and place and so on and so forth for modern learning spaces, and really laying out what each school had to offer, looking at HVAC and square footage, all of those important pieces. In addition to that, then, following that, facility survey was also taken, and there was a community-wide study and a facilities task force that came forward with recommendations that became part of the referendum. And I just want to share those with everyone once again. The facilities task force recommendations were as follows. Looking at and examining attendance boundaries was a recommendation at all levels, and to consider making changes to address overcrowding on the east side. If you recall, that was one of the important parts of the discussion, is what was going on the east side as well. Address the needs at Baird Elementary. Create a new K-8 on the east side. Create a new East Side High School. Ensure all high schools remain vibrant with flexible learning spaces and that enrollments in the school equal 1,000 students or fewer. Provide every school with community spaces for community partners, social service agencies, etc. Consider the creation of magnet schools. Ensure that educational spaces are right spaces that are flexible and meet the needs of students. Ensure that schools are customized to meet the needs of the students they serve, and expand opportunities in existing schools for students in accordance with market trends. So once the recommendations were there, there was a facility survey that went out and the task force recommendations, and then the board took all of that under advisement and created the referendum that went out. And so that after phase one, a referendum took place. The discussions took place. There were 4 community-wide meetings as well. And then in 2017, in April, a referendum was moved forward. Some of the priorities that are on this list were not moved forward by the board after their consideration, but there were some key areas that did move forward. One of the things was the construction of Baird, which was one of the recommendations, so a new Baird school. In addition to that, community spaces, direct and secure entrances was another priority of the board. And then another piece was looking forward for future growth on the east side, and also looking at how do we bring our littlest learners home. There were a number of places. Some of the students were at Frable, some were at the Early Learning Center, which it was a rental space. So one of the priorities was around that, and then a fine arts strand as well. So those were all the buckets, as well as a set aside for John Dewey Academy of Learning of $2.25 million. So the total referendum for facilities was $68.25. And from that investment in our community, the priorities were addressed. So our schools that received secure entrances included Keller, Doty, Weequahic, King, Jackson, Jefferson, and Wilder. The Fine Arts Strand, in addition, put on Webster Elementary for the arts, Washington Middle School, and East High School. Looking at future growth on the east side, additional classroom space was afforded at Red Smith, at Baird, and Martin. In addition to that, some additions for the bringing our kinders home included Baird, Martin, Eisenhower, Dans, and Sullivan. There was a large commons and additional classrooms added at Edison Middle School. And then community spaces can be found at Eisenhower, Baird, Dans, Doty, Keller, and East High School. So that's where the referendum dollars went for facilities after the studies and community survey and so forth, for $68.25 million, with the acknowledgement that $2.25 is still set aside for John Dewey. And I don't know, Mike, if you have anything else that I missed, or we're good to go. All right. Then following that, if you look at phase 2, during the same time when the board made the decision not to move on a new high school and advance that discussion, a secondary schools capacity task force met. And they met and presented to the board in June of 2017. And out of their recommendations included making boundary changes, looking at potential alternative schedules, and a piece that I know has been addressed somewhat is the parking and traffic flow, and making a different separate entrance on one side of the school coming off of Bader, I think. Is that accurate?
Dan's Avenue.
Dan's Avenue, okay, thank you. And then the other part with that, in addition to that in 2017, as another phase was looking at boundaries, and it was a boundary task force. They started their work in November of 2017 and then finished in June of 2018. And the recommendations from the boundary task force included reproducing popular programs, providing transportation opportunities, marketing all programs of the district, really focusing on the power of choice, shifting feeder patterns at middle schools and high schools so they would be in better alignment, monitoring growth at the east side, and maintaining socioeconomic diversity. So those were the recommendations out of those two task forces. Then from there, in January, December, we met and we talked through a number of these opportunities that were presented and brought forward a guiding change for right-sizing the district that Casey's going to go through in just a minute. But before we do that, I just want to talk about 3 board retreats we also had and focus just a little bit of what we did at those retreats in December and also in January before going out for a survey, community-wide survey again. In the board retreat in December, we again looked more specifically at boundary changes, you probably recall, and that's phase 3. Really looking at the feeder patterns and how they were split and could we consolidate those and align those better. And then the board said, do not increase split feeder patterns unless there's a compelling reason to do so. The board also said no domino widespread boundary changes. Looking at must be geographical and must consider bilingual. And that's in regard to boundary changes. In addition, when you talked about grade reconfiguration, you said the K-8 option is most attractive option. And then talked about the K-8 option on both the east and the west sides. Right now we have K-8 only on the east. K-2 and 3-5 possible solutions for the west side to address some of the empty spaces. And then talked about magnet schools, creating a draw on the west side, and then a K-8 on the west side. So those were the board retreat recommendations in December. In addition, there was discussion around Preble, that perhaps an addition should not be done to increase capacity. And then you also talked about consolidation and repurpose. And the board said, consolidation and repurpose only if a school is repurposed to provide additional learning opportunities for students. So then from there, the community-wide survey was developed, and it was an online survey focused in on a number of issues that have come up to gather interest in a proposed right-sizing ideas and a potential future referendum. It was offered in 2 languages, English and Spanish. The questions were provided to each of you, members of the board, for your review in February 18th before it went out to the public. Communication was sent out via press release, media, postcards to all households, through the Education Connection on our website, social media, and an ad in the Press Gazette to make people aware that the survey was going out. And then the Equity Department assisted in reaching stakeholder groups, all stakeholder groups, Paper copies were available at school and the district office, and the survey ran from March 1st to March 22nd, and the board report came to you on April 22nd of 2019. So that brings us up to date. We did have a retreat then. We had much of what I'm sharing with you was shared on January 21st. And then July 11th, when Casey and Janelle were here the last time, we explored a number of options and opportunities to explore further. And that brings us pretty much up to speed as where we've been. And so I think the next step is to really go back and look more deeply at the guiding change to see if it meets your needs at this time or if there's opportunity to change anything in there. But before I do that, are there any questions that either Mike or I can answer before you move that forward? I know it's a lot, but it's all on the website too, so people can go back and look. But it's, when you think about, we started with a lot, our deep dive into each of our schools, and then looked at going out for referendum after the recommendations and moving that forward. The continuation of the discussion, because we have not addressed all the needs at this time, continues as we move forward. So the guiding change document, the governance question for all of you is, what are the short-term and long-term solutions needed to best address equitable programming and access for students across the district? I added the word needed. I apologize. Take that out. Okay. Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say that I do appreciate this kind of historical path and taking us through that again to just kind of remind us all of the enormous amount of work and time and effort that our community has done, our staff has done, the board here. A lot of that happened before I was here. A lot of those big decisions and a lot of that work. But we're all kind of reaping the benefits of that right now and will for years to come. So thank you for just kind of bringing us through that again, because I wasn't here for a lot of that work, and it's helpful to just revisit it. So thank you.
Can I just add something? Lori, do we have the survey, just the one-pager that we could, the results that we could hand out to the board, please? I think that would be great. I just want to underscore here the massive amount of work that has gone in the last 2 to 3 years. The work that you, your community, your staff has done. When I look at the sample size of this survey, I think it was around 2,000 individuals, very diverse population that responded. Some really great numbers on what the community wants to see. So I'd like for you to have that handy as we're going through this. And then we'll get right into the guiding change document. Hi, Eric.
Can you just speak to a little bit more to the diversity of the people who took the survey? I know you don't have it right in front of you, so I apologize, but just curious.
That's okay. I think Lori has those demographics in terms of what that population sample size looks like. So I'd like for Lori has that information, if she could please share that with the board so you guys have an understanding. I believe the survey was done in, what, 2018?
This was done in 2019.
2019?
Yep, it was right.
Yep.
Last spring.
Yep. I think it's going to be important for the board to understand the demographic groups, because as we're looking at the feedback. While she's pulling it up, we have the guiding change document right behind you. You will notice that there's highlighted comments in all 3 sections around the why, the how, and the what. So I'm going to go back to this guiding change is related to facilities. That is on the top of the document. I will read the governance question again. What are the short-term and long-term solutions to best address equitable programming and access for students across the district? Just want to make sure we understand. Okay.
Go ahead, Rhonda.
Can it just be stated for the record, the guiding change document and the considerations, just how everything was developed and put into this document and who was involved?
That's great. Yep. Who wants to address that? Yep.
If memory serves me, on December 18th of 2017 is when we brought that forward.
The guiding change?
Yeah.
Was this January.
January.
We brought the guiding change to the board.
In 2019.
Based off of the information we'd gotten at the December 11th retreat.
Okay. So we brought it forward. We had the discussion on December 11th, and then brought it forward based on what we heard for the board's consideration. And I recall the discussion with the Board of Education and looking at that and making any changes, recommendations.
Lori, can you?
Yeah.
Lori, can you make sure you turn your microphone on? Thanks.
All right, do you want me to touch those demographics quick? Okay, so so for age group, we had 0.68% of those that took this survey were 18 or under. 1.66% were 19 to 25, 14.99% were 26 to 34, 39% were 35 to 44, 24.69 were 45 to 54, 55 to 64 age group was 10.86%, and 7.96% were 65 or over. We had 67.18% of them lived in Green Bay, 11.7% in Village of Alloway, 13.11% in the Village of Bellevue, 0.17% in the town of Eaton, 0.68% in town of Humboldt, 0.55% in Ledgeview, 4.68% in the town of Scott, and then 2.55% in other, because remember it was an online survey, so people who were outside of the district could take it if they so desired. And then how long you lived in the district, fewer than 2 years was 5.24, between 2 and 5 years is 10.81. Again, this is all available on the website, so if people don't need to necessarily take notes on it. Between 5 and 10 years, it was 13.96%. Between 10 and 20 years, 28.14%, and between 20 and 30 years, 16.6%, and then more than 30 years, 25.24%. Joe Donovan, who helped us with this survey, did take our numbers and reflect those against the demographics of our community and felt that they were very much in line with the community. So when we think about how many people in the district are of those certain age groups, felt that that was very much in line with what it was a good reflection of the community at large. So, and then it breaks it down even further as far as how many people took this survey, had children, preschool children, how many people had kids in the district, that's all there as well. So, and even what schools our kids attended. So that survey is available under the Redesign 2020 link on the district website.
But I'm assuming it's probably impossible to know socioeconomic-wise what the demographics are.
We did not ask that question.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions on that? Great. So I'd like to go over each of these components on the guiding change document, please. I'm going to read this. I want to make sure that you're comfortable with the way it's written. Is there anything that's missing that we did not capture? Again, I will say to you, the board right behind you has items highlighted that are relevant and important for our discussion. So let's start with the context and reality, the why behind why we need to do this. Enrollment inequities. There is capacity for students on the west side of the district. There is potential growth opportunities with new housing developments on the east side. Changing educational landscape. There's declining enrollment. There's intra-district transfer, vouchers. The goal is to set the district up for both short and long-term success by maximizing resources and creating greater efficiencies to achieve the mission and vision set out by the Board of Education. More than 15% of student body is mobile. Instructional practice and building space no longer aligns to current and future programming. Current feeder school attendance for elementary to secondary in some schools is not ideal. Projections show declining enrollment in some schools projected while increased enrollment in others. Programs are not equitably accessible for all. Transportation routes and traffic patterns are not always optimal. What do you guys think? We good? Any issues on the why? We good? Yes? Good, perfect. So please note the highlighted components around changing educational landscape and some of the subsets that I went over. If it's not highlighted on your copy, please underscore it because it'll be important to our discussion tomorrow. So let's move over to acceptable means, the how considerations on how we're going to get this accomplished. District's mission, vision, and strategic priorities, current program delivery, the voice of all stakeholder groups, fiscal impact, flexibility of decisions, ensuring that there is little need for adjustment in the future, efficient and cost-effective transportation, adherence to the board policy, elementary school student feeder patterns to middle and high schools, state and federal laws and guidelines, enrollment and capacity data to drive decisions, programming and services that meet the needs of the student population being served in the school attendance area. Any concerns?
I'm just curious how we are going to weigh the voice of all stakeholder groups. I know we're going to try to gather it, but I'm just wondering how we're going to use that to drive our decision and how we're going to weigh that.
I think it's, if you think about where we started tonight, I think the board has to decide how you want to weigh it. So in other words, we talk about the timeline and methodology for public participation, and it will be up to the board as it has been in the past. For example, in 2016, the board looked at survey data and that kind of information. We had 4 public engagement sessions and so forth. People wrote in, people wrote to the board, and so forth. So again, it's what you value and what you want to see, because it's going to be your decision, what you're comfortable with and how you'd like to see that. And we'll support whatever that need is.
And I would add, I think a great example of that was when we worked to determine what was going to go into our referendum in 2017. Mm-hmm. And we had similar meetings to these, lots of information. We put forth what we thought was our best work, and then we had, like you said, multiple listening sessions, and we had at least 2 more iterations of that plan based upon the input that we were getting from people that were going to those schools or would be affected or just anybody. And so that was one way that we did. We had a plan, we got community input, we retooled the plan, we got community input, we continued that process until we had something that we were comfortable with.
Can I ask how long that process took, or how long? I wasn't on the board then, so I'm just wondering.
Well, the process to get to what our initial referendum plan was a long process. But then it was, we had board meetings every couple weeks, so probably over 2 or 3 months we did that. Do you remember? It seemed like it was about 2 or 3 months, and every single board meeting we had during that time, we were re-looking at tweaks to the plan as we move forward. But do you remember the work to get to the referendum started with the facility study, and that was it took us probably a year at least, to get to our first iteration that we put forward for the referendum projects.
Okay, I'm just wondering the public input process. 2 to 3 months.
Oh, we had, no. The 2 to 3 months was the period of time when we put forth, here's what we think our referendum will be. And that was the 2 to 3 months. So we had open forum, community engagement at every single one of those meetings during that time period. And then the team went back and took all that input and said, okay, well, how about this, how about this, how about this? And they put forth the second iteration and said, okay, based on what we've heard, this is what we've got now. And then we continued that at least 3 times and maybe 4. But the time before we got to the referendum was when we had 4 large community listening sessions. We had a facilities study. We were getting input over lots and lots of different ideas and considerations from that facility study.
So more than 3 months.
Oh, that was over a year.
Right.
It was the whole phase 1.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, okay.
Yeah.
That's what I'm
that
looking
was that
for
phase, and then the short phase was fine tuning our referendum projects.
Okay. Thank you.
And not even fine tuning. We made some pretty significant changes during that time too, I think, as I recall.
Just the magnitude, because there were 17 schools involved, 68.25 million. And obviously with that also was the operations referendum of 16.5 million for 10 years. So a total of 165 million in operations. So, and I think it's a little bit different than moving for the referendum though, because we did 70, more than 70 meetings. Different than you know, this is somewhat of a different conversation because, you know, it depends. So
the scale of this seems like it's going to be smaller than the scale of what we did on the east side.
Yeah.
So I just have a question then for Rhonda. You brought up the voice of all stakeholder groups and the weight that we're going to put on that. I'd like to ask Rhonda and the group, if we're putting the children at the center of what we're doing, what weight do you think we should give? In terms of the community, in terms of the expertise around this table, in terms of the expertise for the staff, from a programming facility perspective? How would you break that up? Just a question.
And me asking this question comes from being asked that frequently. We gave this input. And again, when people sometimes, when they give input and they see a significant amount of input and it falls flat, they want to know sometimes the value of that input and why they should give input. And I would always like to come back with, well, actually, it does matter what you say because X, Y, and Z. And so I'm looking at clarifying and having some sort of a concrete idea of really when someone does ask, what will it mean if I give input? Where will it go? How will you weigh it? How will it drive your decision making? Will it matter? And I would like to be able to say more than, well, of course it does, without just giving a platitude or placating somebody. I'd like to know that I'd like to have a better idea of where that input will go, because so often I hear from people, we gave input, heartfelt input, we took off we took off work, we got babysitters, we came in, came to meetings and spoke. Was overwhelmingly in one direction and didn't matter. So I think for me personally, I'm not speaking for my board members, I would definitely like to have a better idea so that when I am asked that question, and I already have been asked, and so I know I will be again, what that looks like in order to answer thoughtfully and in a genuine way.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. So are you speaking specifically around community and parents? So just kind of pivoting here around staff and their feedback. Would you say the same thing and the expertise that's in the school district?
I'm speaking from a place of where I typically hear the question, and that would be families, community. That's who asks me, or questions it. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, Andrew.
Yeah, I would add to that for me individually, I look at my job as a board member of combining combining input from all sources, and that could include something that experts have told me is slightly less good because of this technical reason, and yet because of the input I get from the community, I might want to do that thing anyways. I might want to do it even though it costs a little more, or even though there's a little bit of, it's not the perfect thing for bus efficiency or staffing or something like that. Obviously, it's a trade-off. I know I have been specifically approached, asked before this meeting by community members, I've been told, I've heard this is a done deal already. That at least one thing on this list has already been decided it will happen. I assured them that even if someone thinks they decided that, which I don't have any reason to believe that, even if someone thinks they made that decision, whoever it might be, that's impossible because only the board can make these decisions. So I would agree with that. If we have, we may end up making a decision that is not in line with the majority of people who approach us after we consider all the factors. However, yeah, and this is part of why going out early instead of late in the process is important, because there's time to shape things. I think other times maybe we've gone out a little too late in a process. So I assured people that told me that they think a decision is made that there will be multiple opportunities for public input.
Great, thank you. Anybody else?
I would add to that as Andrew said, we consider all of these things on this list and have to weigh it and everything. But even for stakeholder groups that feel like they gave it their all and came in and gave heartfelt messages to us, and we voted against that, I would offer that when I hear that, when I hear that kind of input, I'm very carefully listening for, okay, if I make the change that they don't want, what can I do once the change has been made to make it easier for this and that, because that's the message I'm hearing from people that are giving me their opinions. So it's not, for me, it's not just the decision itself, but it's what we do after the decision has been made based on the input that I've received from stakeholder groups.
Very good.
Most particularly, families and parents at that point, because you're trying to make that transition for them as good as you can.
Yep. Anybody else? Katie? Laura? Nothing? Eric? We're all good? I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not just a single source, right? That you have to look at things holistically. If we're putting the kids at the center of everything that we're doing, you have to look at everybody's feedback and make the best decision that's going to work for the children. Are we in agreement with that? Great. Any changes around the how considerations? We're good around the why. We're good around the how, with the exception of there was a question around the stakeholder groups and how much weight we're going to put on that. Anything else? Okay. The results, the what, the solutions, align to the district's mission, vision, and strategic priorities, grounded in the district's core values, equity, engagement, and excellence, result in greater efficiencies to deliver high-quality programming for all students, take into account the voice of all stakeholder groups, align to attendance areas that are contiguous and follow natural boundaries when and if possible, conducive to future growth, fiscally responsible, flexible, affording school capacity to expand and contract based on enrollment shifts, align to board policy, minimize the need for future adjustment to attendance boundaries, align elementary feeder patterns to middle and high schools, follow state and federal laws and guidelines, developed using data, enrollment and capacity data, as well as the age of the facilities to drive decisions, balance fiscal responsibility, student need-based resource allocation with board priorities. What do you guys think?
Brenda?
Oh, Andrew, sorry.
The only thing I guess I would say, and I don't think there's really too many of these that aren't also a law, but we have enough mandates as it is, and if there's something that's a state or a federal guideline or suggestion that isn't binding by law, again, there's probably not a lot of those. Probably things are called guidelines and they're in a law. I guess to that point, I think we know better than the outside agencies, so if something is just a guideline and not binding, I wouldn't consider myself bound to it.
Yes, so I would, just want to highlight here a couple of things around the resulting greater efficiency to deliver high quality programming for all students, the fiscal responsibility, and the flexible affording school capacity to expand and contract based on enrollment shifts. Any guidelines or policies that affect those three, do you think?
Our own internal policies?
Yep.
Okay, not state.
Not state.
Okay.
Because I see, if you look at the why, it's the changing educational landscape, right? That's driven by what? What's happening in the community as people coming in, going out, transferring, they're making movements, they're, shifting around. And then fiscal impact is the how, highlighted. The voice of all stakeholders. I think it's the voice of all stakeholders that's highlighted in the how. And the what solutions is the greater efficiencies, fiscal responsibility, and the flexibility. Internal policies and guidelines. Anything that is not aligned to these three things, these three buckets that we need to look at, we need to change, that you have a heartburn around.
With the redesign, I know this was a question that was asked, and it's on my mind just looking at this. And during this conversation, we had, I think, 10 different things that we talked about, considered, threw around. How was it determined the trajectory of what we would explore next?
In terms of the opportunities that are coming forward tomorrow for discussion? Yeah, tomorrow the discussion is really around a lease that's running out. We're in rented space for NEW School of Innovation, as well as John Dewey Academy of Learning. We know that we have $2.25 million in referendum dollars that were aligned and earmarked for John Dewey, and we also know that the children, the enrollment numbers at Head Start will be, or the enrollment numbers at Keller will be changing because of the Head Start West School. So those are really the pieces of discussion that are on the table tomorrow to bring forward because of the timing and urgency around them. And the lease runs out in 2021. So go ahead.
Because again, I've been asked this, so for transparency purposes, who had that discussion where it was determined? I mean, I'm hearing what you're saying about that, but then who said, yes, this is what we're going to discuss in February?
These are discussions that have come up through administration, through finance, the finance department, and through the folks that we work with in central office as we look to the future and say to the Board of Education, these are areas of priority and need that need to be addressed sooner than later. But there are certainly other things that can be discussed. These are the ones that have a timeline on them.
And we discussed when we approved the contract
with
for the
Cherry
lease,
Street.
discussed the fact that we would have to make some decisions in 2 years about that because we just signed a 2-year lease, knowing that we were working toward finding a permanent home for those two schools, and that this would become part of our conversation.
Thanks, Rhonda. Those are great questions. Can I just respectfully ask that if you say, I've heard or people have asked me, if we could just, if you heard it from one person, 2 people, 3 people, 100 people, 50,000 people, because I think that gives us some context around what's the heartburn around majority of the individuals if you're speaking from a community perspective, because that doesn't give me any context like, well, someone came and asked me, is that one person? Very different outlier, one person versus 100 people that are saying the same thing. So if we could just be reminded of that. Yeah, sure.
I would say at least 50 people. Thank you.
Any other questions on this? Need to make any additional changes? Is there anything that you have wanted to ask around this guiding change document and you did not get a chance to ask previously as this was put together? Are we good? Is this the foundation for moving forward tomorrow on our discussion around ideation? And for discussion? Nothing needs to change on here. We're good. Yes? Yes?
Yes.
We're good? Perfect. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who's going to discuss enrollment projections for the remainder of our presentation.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to start by looking at the overall district projections. What we have seen is I've been working on projections since 2005. And the first 11 years that I did projections, every year we had some increase in enrollment. Then starting in 2017-18 was the first year that we actually had a decline. And we've seen a decline in our overall third Friday count for the last 3 years. Now, the one thing I want to mention is that the third Friday count, which is the membership count, is different than what I use for projections. What I use for projections are the actual students that are in our school. So I include all the Head Start students. I include the students that are that are transferred into the district from other districts. Because what we do is we use these numbers for planning and how many seats that we need into our schools. So it's a little bit different than our membership count. So does anybody have any questions regarding that? So what we have seen, like I said, the last 3 years there was a decline, but actually there's been a very slight overall increase in our district-wide enrollment for the students that are actually here in the district. It's been very slight, almost level by just a few students. So the, district-wide, so then the next one would be just to look at the different age levels. So what we're seeing is we saw a decline at our elementary levels. What we had noticed is about 5 years ago that in our school district we had declining birth rates. What we do is we start off, we get our birth rates that are from Madison that are in our district, and we go through and we follow those birth rates on how many births actually end up coming to our 5-year-old kindergarten class, and we kind of track that as a historical. But what we've noticed that in the last 5 years that the birth rates have declined in the school district.
That's statewide as well, right? It's not just Green Bay.
Yeah, I haven't been following statewide, but I, do have the in Green Bay district that's been true. So we've seen.
Mike, can I just ask a question? I'm sorry. When you talk about projections, how are you determining the projections? Is there a model that you use, or is there some?
Yes, what we have done is we use the grade progression ratio model. So we look at a 5-year history on students that have moved through the district starting, and that's where we start with our birth rates and determining historically what that model looks like. Okay, so at elementary is where we're seeing our largest decline. The next slide would be the middle school. We're also seeing actually the last year or two, we've actually had a little bump up in our middle school. And again, this is because of the larger number of elementaries that are now moving into our middle school. And as we see the high school, you're going to see that the high school is the last place that we're going to be seeing a decline because of that movement of students through the district. So we had actually this year we had a slight increase at the middle school level, but we're also projecting, over the 10-year period that would also be declining. And then at the high school level, which is the last slide, is it was level for the last up until last year or this present year, and then we did have a slight decline at the high schools. So when we look at the general overall projections, we're going to continue to see the biggest decline at our middle schools. So in a 5-year time period, we're going to have approximately 3.75% decline at elementary, with almost an 8.71 decline at the middle school level. But because of those students moving through, we're actually going to see in the next 5 years about just under 5% increase at the high school level. So it's going to take a while before we actually start declining at our upper levels. Over 10 years, we're still seeing a little over 4% decline at the elementaries. Still a large decline at the high schools of over 9%. And then we're starting to see a slight decline at the high schools in 10 years of 2.18%. So you can see that as the students have been moving through, we'll start seeing that later in the high schools, but it's going to take about 10 years before we start seeing that decline at the high school level.
Hey, Mike, I have a question on your capacity numbers here. That top line is the capacity district-wide for across the board for all age groups, and then specifically for elementary, the capacity, and then for middle school and high school, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And as we move into the sheet that has the yellow and the red on it, I think there we can start looking at individual schools. All the red numbers are under capacity. Now, I guess I just want to make a little statement on capacity to begin with. Capacity, when we do capacity, we look at taking all the classrooms and using them as they could be used for maximum usage of the building. So typically, an elementary school that isn't AGR would have 25 students per class, so that's how we figured. And AGR schools, we look at 18 students per classrooms, kindergarten through 3rd grade, and then 25 for 4th and 5th grade. But because of programs that are sometimes moved to schools, special ed programs where they're OT-PT areas, that also plays into capacities. And a lot of times we'll have programs move from year to year to different schools, early childhood, different special ed programs that will, really affect the capacity. So a lot of times, even that we're showing that the building's under capacity, the rooms are being used, but they're just not being used as standard classrooms. We would have to sometimes shift some of the programs to add more students to those schools. So when we look at
Can I just ask a question? This is maybe you don't have the answer right now, but just financially, how does because we talked about in the guiding change document, the fiscal impact and fiscal responsibility. What is the cost when we don't have our schools at capacity or near capacity? How does that affect the district?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have that figure.
Maybe we could get that tomorrow when we're talking.
If I could, Casey, I think one of the pieces that we see right now, we're in staffing, for example, and just the efficiencies in staffing. We may have a school, for example, that has one section of first grade and one section of second grade. So when the class size hits at the limit, then you have very tiny class sizes because you have to split the class. So now instead of having one teacher for first grade for 25 students, you've got 27. So now you need 2 teachers. And in a larger school, you can smooth that out and you might not need an additional teacher. So that's one of the pieces that's hard to know because of actual enrollment numbers, what that looks like, but it's far more efficient to be able to have multiple sections of a grade level so that you have a little more ability to balance class size. And so you're running 9s or 10s in a classroom, and we've had to do that in some of our classrooms. So that would be about a $70,000, $80,000 every teacher person. That would be.
So
This is more informal, Andrew. So
okay,
go
you
ahead
just jump in. All right.
Yeah.
So I guess a couple of things. So if we are saying, and I think we're generally doing this. I've heard of just a couple cases where there's maybe a 26 in an elementary, and I'll just setting aside AGR for the moment just to stay on. If we're saying that we want not to go over 25, then I would expect then, because there aren't any 26s or 27s to balance out the 24s and the 23s, then should something lower than 25 be our planning number for capacity?
It's just been, the historical that we've used the 25 as an average classroom. I guess I don't know what other number at this time that you would look at using, because that's kind of our standard, trying to staff at 25.
Well, I guess a place you could go would be the per building, the average non-AGR elementary could be a place to go. I mean, maybe this. I mean, it's possible that the difference between 22 and 25 doesn't really change anything because of number of classrooms, and so it's possible I'm going down a rabbit hole that doesn't need to be gone down. But an average of 25 is not correct because we have virtually no 26s except if someone comes in late in the year in elementary, from what I understand. So there wouldn't be a balancing number of over 25 to cover the under 25, and especially in small buildings, it would be, anyways, I guess that's my point with that. And then the other thing with the if we're relying primarily on the grade projection model, if we find, I guess, if we crack the code of imbalanced transfers in and transfers out, then that could increase enrollment, right? Because the grade progression takes into account who continues to the next grade or who doesn't with us for any reason. Is that right?
That's correct. And as we get further in here, we're going to talk about transfers within the district and why projections are kind of skewed a little bit because of a lot of movement that we have in the district. But so I guess unless anybody has any questions, I'll just finish up the projections. So on the sheet that we handed out, we have the individual schools, and we just did a recap, so it was an easy glimpse to see what the schools are at, what the enrollment will be in 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years. Again, these are our projections. As you can see, these have all been updated with our referendum projects. So prior to the referendum, we had numerous schools that were over capacity, especially on the east side. Now with the referendum, we have very few, and actually the schools that are over capacity, that were showing over capacity, are choice schools. Although the capacity that we use is the capacity that when the program was actually set up, the program was actually set up, and what they did is they had talked about having 50 students per grade level. And so we've always used the 300 at the elementary school and the 150 at the middle school as the capacity. Now the building technically can handle more, and they've choiced to allow more students into this program. Same thing with Da Vinci. So those are why those schools are showing, because the capacities there are a capacity that was just given to the school and isn't really a building capacity. Okay, so elementaries, what you'll see is that we broke it down between east side and west side. So we have capacity this year on the east side of 694 students under capacity, and within 10 years we look on the east side that we're going to have a capacity of 1,092 students under capacity. So we did the same thing on the west side, and so that capacity is about 935 under capacity, and it's going to grow a little bit, but not quite as much than we have on the east side. So, but when you look overall, right now we have about 1,629 seats under capacity district-wide in the elementary, and in 10 years we'll have over 2,000 extra capacity in just the elementary school. The second sheet is very similar again with the middle schools. The only school that, besides Aldo and Da Vinci, again because of the set program capacities that we see, are Edison is slightly over capacity this year, but we project that that would be coming under capacity as that middle school enrollment starts to decline. So this year we have about 827 seats in the middle schools that are under capacity, and in 10 years we're projecting about 1,267 under capacity. High school, which is the third sheet, the only school that we've been talking about that we are over capacity is at Preble. We are continuing to project that Preble will remain over capacity. It will grow slightly, but then we're looking at 10 years out that number will most likely start to drop as our elementary students levels starts to filter through, and those enrollments have been dropping. So besides that, looking at overall, we have a capacity of 906 over capacity in our high schools right now of 916, and that number again isn't dropping quite as drastically. So we'll be in 10 years about 1,000 students under capacity at the high school level. Is there any questions regarding this?
If I could just ask a question of the board. So when we're looking at enrollment numbers for all grade levels, based on the changing guide, the guiding change document, where is it aligned to? Which section? Why? Is that clear for everybody? I mean, Mike ran with those numbers pretty quickly. I know we'll talk about this tomorrow again. We'll have the handy dandy paper that he's given you. Just want to make sure we're understanding the why very clearly here. Are we all good? Okay. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, so continue on. So what impacts these projections? I already talked about the birth rates, intra-district transfers. We'll show you a slide in a few minutes about the amount of students that we have transferring within the district. We have an open enrollment out. We have an open enrollment in. Part of the reasons that we've seen, I think, an increase in our enrollment, our students in the district compared to our student count for membership is that open enrollment in this year has increased slightly. There's vouchers out there that are difficult to predict, and then a lot of student mobility. Our current reality. So we have students that are placed within the district for program placements like English language learners and special education. Students that transfer in the district, some of them are by parents' choice because of where they have childcare, sometimes where they work, and just because of the programs in the school, the parents choose certain schools. McKinney-Vento, students affect where they're living and where they're actually going to school. Continuation, some families are in a certain school, they'll move to a different area, the city, and they choose to leave their student at that school to continue on. Specialty schools draw, schools like Aldo, Da Vinci, JADAL, NEW, and then our Models 3 heads 4K and Head Starts. And then programming also with the IB, we see students going into, transferring into Chapel and into West and Franklin for those programs, along with fine arts, culinary, the STEM, and the dual language program. So those all affect our current reality. So we pulled up Guide K-12, and it's very difficult to see on this slide, but what you'll find is that we have all those dots represent students that go to schools outside their attendance area. So they live in a specific attendance area and they choice or are placed at a school outside their attendance area. That's approximately 25% of our student body goes to schools that are not their attendance area school. They stay within our district, so they would go to, they might be living in the Eisenhower attendance area, but they might be going to school at King, and there are students that are going from one side of the district all the way to the other side of the district. We can pull up every student and see where their home attendance area is and where they're actually going to school.
Maybe this question is for Michelle. Michelle, could you just talk a little bit about why that's an issue with that intra-mobility?
I think one of the things you asked, who made the decision to bring the documents forward, or the schools tomorrow. We study all of this and look at all of this data that you're getting tonight to really analyze what the impact is, not only in staffing. Right now we're in staffing, looking at when we talk about identifying staffing for schools, knowing that this is what it looks like, it makes it a very, very challenging opportunity to afford and make sure we have the right people in the right schools, because we know by come fall we could have totally different numbers and populations of students. So that's one of the challenges and opportunities we have. Another piece is really thinking about the capacity of the schools, and sometimes you hear, a school is closed and there's opportunity that a family wants to go into a neighboring school and they can't, or you may have a school that, this happened a number of years ago, where we afforded open enrollment in a school, and then all of a sudden the neighborhood populated with all new families. So it is a continuous monitoring effort around our schools to make sure that this occur, we do our best. And I think that there's so many reasons why parents' choice, it can be a daycare situation that's nearby. It can be, they might have a legacy at that school and their family likes that school. They might have just like a certain programming piece at the school and so forth. So there's just a whole variety of reasons. Sometimes they want to be with friends and at a different school. So again, they might, it's just a wide open choice situation, and we try to accommodate as much of it as we can so that students and families can choose. And that's a nice part with the number of schools.
Michelle, can you talk a little bit about, I know we've discussed this in the past, on our state report card, the mobility within the district is noted. And for some reason, and I don't know exactly why, that rate is often considerably lower than the actual rate within our, like it's usually like around half of what the reality is.
They only count one move a year. That's my understanding, if I'm accurate in that. They count one time. So if a child moves, they're considered mobile. But we have children sometimes that move 2-3 times during the school year. They might be in 3 different schools. And so that's why if we used to count, the state used to count all of the moves a child makes during the school year. And it may be a situation where the family is homeless for a period of time, and then they stay at a school or move and so forth. So many of our children sadly have to move more than once in a school year if they move. So that can happen.
I just want to ask a couple of questions of the board. What does this map tell you? Why is this an issue?
It tells me that we need to pay attention to the flexible part of the what. We can't lock in enrollment and not have any wiggle room in our schools for that.
Yeah. And which part of the guiding change document does this fall under?
It's the why. Yeah.
Trying to get you guys to see something here. There's a common theme. I need you to really pay attention to why we're presenting this data today. So when we're going into our session tomorrow, you'll be ready to talk about ideas and options. Anything else around this data? And anything else that Mike has shared? Was there anything else, Mike?
Mike regularly shares data with us like this, and so this isn't kind of the first time we've seen this. We see it, I mean, we see this at least a couple times a year, and it's always pretty compelling, frankly.
So what do you do with that data then, once you review it as a board?
Sometimes it just is knowledge, and other times it guides decisions that we might make for the following year.
Okay. Anybody else?
And it sometimes just reminds us why this work is so hard.
Yep. Yeah, fiscal responsibility, right? Great. Anything else? Michelle, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, excuse me. One of the important parts is to recognize this is very complex. So tomorrow, the opportunities that we're bringing forward for discussion, and I know that on the slide we put that disclaimer that these are just the start. And again, this is why it's so important to recognize, as Mr. Becker started with, there's no done deals yet. It's a really deep conversation, and tomorrow with the discussions, it's wide open. So again, I think the most important thing, administration has worked really hard to try to prepare so that we can be responsive to your questions. And one of the opportunities then will be, as the board asks the questions and sends us out to explore further and has a framework around what those discussions need to look like in your eyes so that we bring back the data that you'd like to see. We just want to make sure that we have a very clear understanding of where you want us to head. I mean, I think that one of the opportunities tomorrow is you'll realize how wide open there are so many places and spaces to go because of the current reality around the movement and its, declining enrollment, which sends us into an important place and space as well in terms of our fiscal and financial responsibilities to our students and around issues of equity and access as well, and to our community. So that's why these discussions are so important, and the timing is really important now because we also recognize that not only are we needing to ensure equitable programming, but also as the district has always done, and we haven't discussed this for a while, but the referendums were always a scheduled part of managing debt in the past, and it's really to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a place, in a space and time in the future where the debt has dropped so low that you have to go out and ask taxpayers to raise their taxes. And that's really what the board has really done for many, as long as I've been here, but well before my time, is to manage that debt so that that I'm not sure I'm saying exactly accurate, but to make sure that our tax burden doesn't fall on our taxpayers while still maintaining vibrant forward schools for our students and the best we can.
Can I just note that first of all, I just must say I welcome this conversation. It's very important to do this kind of long-term planning, but that Green Bay isn't really unique in this, that these conversations are happening all over this state and around this country of how to best use resources. As long as we're going to be chronically underfunded, that we are going to have these conversations. And no one enjoys them, but they're necessary, and we're gonna do it. So,
thank you, Laura. I have to agree. I was in a meeting, and Eric was there as well yesterday morning, while different districts in our neighborhoods were talking about the referendums, because they're going out for referendums in April as well, and one is still in a neighboring district has a referendum, and they're going out for another referendum. So again, that's a really critically important part of the discussion. And also the recognition that as our teachers, and it's in one of the points in the guiding change, is the recognition that our teachers know how to teach, and they know what space they need and what resources they need to address the children that they serve. And so to that end, to have the appropriate space in place is really important as well. So that's why, as you come up with solutions and think about a school like John Dewey, for example, that's so project-based driven, and think about that in terms of the teachers who are working that work and the students that are engaged. And that's a really important school for many students, as all of our schools are, to think about that place and space for students and what would serve what the teachers are trying to do to deliver this incredible curriculum and bring these students along so they're well prepared for the future. So it's a critical part of the discussion.
Oops, sorry, Michelle. I was just curious. I want, in preparation for tomorrow, to ask the board
Do you feel like you need any more information on why current feeder school attendance for elementary to secondary in some schools is not ideal? Or is that data that is usually brought to you pretty clear in terms of that? Just want to make sure we're giving you kind of still that context of why, and we can prepare that ahead of time. In addition, is everybody comfortable with which programs are not equitably accessible for all? Are those things that the board feels good about? I just wanted to pose that question to y'all.
There's, it might be useful to have, I know it already exists, is the map of where the splits are in our elementary schools and where our elementaries feed into the middle and high schools, just as reference. We've seen that sometime in the last year, but it's always good to remind ourselves.
Yes, we can provide you that. I just want to let you know is that when we put together the splits and those percentages, they're done on the students that live in those attendance areas that should be going to that middle school. And again, with that amount of inter-district transfer we have, year to year, those aren't the actual outcomes.
Well, I know, what is it, 2 years ago, we allowed a little more flexible choice in our split feeders, so that skews those numbers too.
Right. So even though we say it goes 25% to one middle school and 75 to another, because of those students moving around, they may be 30 and 70 one year, and the next year they may be 40 and 60.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We can definitely have that ready for tomorrow. I just want to thank Mike. He's done an amazing job, and I think the board needs to recognize all the work that he's put into getting this data to you in a very simplified, as much as we can, so you can see what's really happening with that student movement. It's really, really important. So I want to just thank Mike for that. It's done amazing work here.
Sorry, you asked us one other item. Which one did you ask us about? The programs not equitably accessible?
Correct.
Yeah. And that's, a lot of that has to do with transportation. Right. And that's on this list somewhere too.
Okay. So there's like an overall like understanding of where there's maybe lacking programs on east, west side, what have you. That's kind of all laid out for you all already?
Will Jeremy be joining us tomorrow by any chance? No. Okay.
Some of that is just we have the programs and they're only in one school. And if we had transportation, then more families might be able to access those programs. And other times I think the question is, we have a great program, and I think the Boundary Task Force told us that maybe consider replicating some of our more successful programs and putting them in a new school. So that's where I think that's my read of what that is on there.
Would it be helpful with the booklet that we have with all of our schools listed and all the programming in it?
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah,
each of the board members could have one of those, and then you could flip through it and see. We have enough copies. I have one, so I can share mine.
I might have one at home. I could try to remember to bring it.
It's just a quick, handy guide.
Yeah.
Great. So we're going to move over to, we have this blank slide here, check for understanding. I just want to open the floor for the board to walk us through what you've learned from A to Z so far, maybe A to G, on the expectations, our norms, guiding change document, and the data, and the why, and how we're going to move forward. If I could just open the floor for all of you to just talk through that. Want to make sure we're all on the same page. Andrew, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think I think generally speaking, the numbers that we are looking at are what's been going on as people, people move around and, kids are coming through or not coming through. But I guess for me, with the, part of what I would like to see us do about declining enrollment will be if there might be a way to get people to rebalance voluntarily through, and so that obviously won't be reflected in grade progression numbers. And I also expect over the next few years that we will do things to prevent transfers out, or maybe even get some transfers back in. So I will certainly will use these as a starting point, but with the understanding that I don't want to see us probably take any schools all the way to capacity, because especially the ones where we might be planning to do something. So I guess that's my takeaway here.
I think when you look at enrollment projections, one thing to remember is that the west side is landlocked, and so those projections are going to be more stable than the east side, because if there's ever a large home building that in that gigantic piece of land that's not developed yet, then that will affect those east side numbers. Go ahead, Eric. Eric, go.
So I guess just overall, when I hear that we're declining enrollment, but I in my head, I think that the east side is more stable, and this shows me that's not the case, that we're really declining all over. And I guess I just tend to look at that as an opportunity, right? I mean, we've got space. We can do some things, and it's going to mean having to make some potentially difficult decisions, but you can also look at that from the other lens and say, we can get creative. And I think that goes back to, again, the work that we'll do tomorrow. Just, hey, we've got a lot of different options. What do you see as the best option? But then going back to the what, and it was highlighted, but thinking about all students.
I just want to go back to something Andrew, thanks Eric. I want to just go back to something Andrew said about, we understand that we're going to not be at full capacity. We shouldn't get there because of the programming changes that we're going to have to make. Underscoring the changes that you're going to have to make. Eventually you are going to have to make those changes, right? Whether outer forces brings you to that decision, or you decide and be innovative in saying, we got to be proactive. So I just want to underscore that. I thought that was a very, it's a good point, and it's impact for the district.
Did you have something, Katie?
Yes. Mike, I'd be curious how difficult would it be for you to bring up the 3-year, 5-year, and 10-year projections from 10 years ago? And if we could get a copy of that tomorrow, because I know this is the new reality, but I'd be curious to see how accurate 10 years ago reality was, and just kind of take a look at it.
I can bring the projections from 10 years ago. I'm not sure if I have them in this exact same format, but I can show you what the projections were 10 years ago.
It was by school, so we can.
Yes.
And I'll just add to that I just remember looking at projections, especially when I first got on the board, and it was uncanny how accurate Mike's projections were to the person. So my question is, he'd be off by 2 students in a school. My question is, those numbers were very accurate then, but we didn't have vouchers, and we had less mobility and things like that. So I'm assuming that the projections are a little bit squishier than they used to be when I first got on the board.
Exactly. 10 years ago, when we were doing projections, we had very little. When students were in attendance area, they were pretty much going to that school, and we had very few, unless they were moved for special programs, very few students that were going to schools that were outside their attendance area. Now I'm saying that 25%.
25, yeah.
And then we didn't have vouchers. We didn't have out of school, out of district transfers. So yes, you're exactly right. They're getting a lot squishier than what they used to be.
Thanks, Katie. That's a great question. I just want to also be very cautionary that 10 years was very different. I think the point's been made here. making decisions today very different in terms of what we're offering from a programming perspective and some of the special needs, et cetera. Want to be very cautious on looking at those numbers. Certainly we can provide those to you. Just historical context, but how we're making decisions is very different today than it was 10 years ago. Laura, what do you think?
A lot of this feels familiar because we did a lot of this talking, or a lot of this work last summer. So it feels like we're revisiting some of this, which is just fine, you know, to be revisiting it. And it'll be interesting tomorrow.
Rhonda?
I'd say everyone covered what I'm thinking. I'm taking notes on it. Yeah.
Christina, did you want to add anything? No. Okay. We're all good? So we've level set for tomorrow. Okay. So tomorrow's, if you go to the very last slide, and discussions for tomorrow will be John Dewey, Northeast Wisconsin, and Keller, just as a starting point. Michelle, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think as the board comes up with ideas and solutions or things to explore, we will try to provide you with what we have. You know, again, one of the things that we do is we've been looking at this since 2016. So we've looked at the data and looked at different enrollment projections. We know what programs are there, so we'll try to be available and provide you with whatever information we can. We may not be able to answer all the questions. Mike decided that he can't join us tomorrow for a very good reason. And so I think that that's a really critically important part. But I do know that both Pete and Lori can probably provide us with information via Guide K-12, and we can always tap Josh on the shoulder as well if we need to bring in an extra resource. And again, we hadn't lined everyone up for attendance because there's a lot of activity and things going on. However, if there are certain things that we can get information during the day through the process, we will certainly pursue those. Transportation questions, as you noted, Laura, we can certainly do that. Again, administration has been looking at this data since 2016. Parts we know well. But again, some of the predictability because of the movement of students changes. I do want to note that our open enrollment out has slowed down in the last several years, and the open enrollment in has increased. So that's another part of what's happening as well. But again, that's a separate conversation but Pete will be here to help and answer any questions around that as well.
So with there being all but one of the parts of, you know, we took one part of redesign 2020 off cycle, and that happened. So by off cycle, I mean early in advance, the Jefferson piece. I'm just wondering here if we have all those pieces we came up with this summer, isn't it possible that with the 3 schools that we're talking about tomorrow, there may or may not be some interaction with the other pieces?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can bring that. The discussion you're talking about for July 11th?
Yeah.
Or
Well, sure, because for example, one of them was about IB. So if we're expanding IB by a lot, that may or may not have something to do with these facilities. So I guess maybe I was expecting us to look at more things at once, but I guess we'll be scheduling another one of these then in the near future, or because there'll still be 6 untouched items left on there.
I look at these 3 as these are the obvious that we have to do, and the rest of what we might bring into the equation doesn't have to necessarily have anything to do with those schools. But I think it would be helpful to have that list, because we did generate that list last summer, just to remind us of what was on there.
Great idea. Definitely have that tomorrow. So we're starting at 9 tomorrow. We ended a little early, a lot early. Any questions?
So I've had several people, quite a few from Keller, ask what's going on. They're concerned. And with this conversation happening tonight, we're going to be coming back tomorrow morning at 9. Obviously, it's during the workday. People can't come back and see what's going on. I'm hoping that there'll be some communication just after this evening with regards to staff at Keller, just to let them know, because there's going to be a lot of questions. I already know this. And I think that we need to do what we can to make sure that they're brought with the conversation as much as possible.
Thank you. And I believe that the principal has been in communication, knowing that this could potentially be a discussion. At this point in time, obviously, the board has said nothing about Keller. We haven't started that conversation, so I don't think it's changed, but certainly we can contact Dan and make him aware that they are aware that it was not discussed this evening. And I think there might be representation from Keller here as well. So,
but I would say that it's not a secret. It's been mentioned a few times. It's listed on our discussion items. They won't be able to come tomorrow. They've had a lot of questions. So it is on their minds, and we may not have gotten into the discussion tonight, but because of that, and because it will be happening tomorrow during the time that they're working, then they won't be able to be here. I'm hoping that there would be some communication, because I'm receiving questions.
I'm sorry. Yes, that actually is part of what we talked about as well. I know that John Magus and the team were planning on communicating directly with Dan if there were some things that should occur right away, and that's been ongoing. The executive directors and the principals have been part of this discussion, the whole discussion, and what we told them is accurate in that the Board of Education is not limited to anything. You're not. You have the data, you have the understanding of the current reality, and so our responsibility is to provide you with that information. We can say, here are some things that we know need to be addressed, but how you choose to address them is strictly up to you, because ultimately you represent the constituency, and we want to provide the best for kids, and we'll continue to that communication. But these decisions are governance decisions, and so again, we'll communicate well with them. And I know that Dan is well aware, that Dan Malberg, the principal, has been in conversations, and I believe the staff has also been part of it. Again, the piece is really important. And I can't stress this enough to all of our community, is that, and Andrew, you said it earlier, the Board of Education makes the decisions at the end of the day. And the intention of this is to get a greater sense from the board how you want the data collected and the voices collected, and we'll bring it back and keep moving that forward. So, but we can communicate with Dan tonight as well. And then I know will be available tomorrow.
Great. We ready for tomorrow? All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Great. We'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Adjourned.
Oh, I said
You have been watching the Green Bay Area Public School District's Board of Education meeting. Please visit the school district's website, www.gbaps.org, to view the program again. If you cannot fully access the information on this video, please let us know the accessibility issue you are having by calling 920-448-2025 or by email at communications@gbaps.org. We will try to provide the information to you in an alternative format and/or make the necessary improvements to make the information accessible.